Hello there, folks. This is Jay Frost speaking to you. And if you were wondering what all that respectful silence was about, it's we're trying to echo the presence of our guest today, who is Sterrin Bird. She'll be appearing on the screen with us in just a minute, and there she is. So I'll be introducing her to you in a moment. In case you're not familiar with her or her work, we'll be speaking together for the next little bit about frenetic fundraising, and so we'll be talking about that again for the next 45 minutes or so, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. So as you saw in those prefatory slides, we would love it if you'd maybe just say down the chat that you're here, where you're from, which part of the country, maybe as well as which organization, anything that occurs to you, and then use the chat as your sandbox to play and have a conversation. And we will try to monitor that a bit. Our producer in the background will be doing that, but we also have the Q&A. So please do utilize that as well for any questions you have. We want to make sure this is built around your needs and interests as always. This series is brought to you, of course, by our friends at DonorSearch, and they have been sponsoring this series back to 2016. So we have about 500 programs we've done, and most of those are available for you in one form or another over at the DonorSearch site or through it. You can find that at donorsearch.net. We won't be talking about them otherwise, unless our guest decides to mention them for some reason. So if you want to know more about them, and I hope you will, because they focus on the donors without whom we couldn't do anything we do, then you can learn all about that at donorsearch.net. And while you're there, just take a look at the resources tab for all that content in the Mastermind series. So with that, I want to jump into the conversation and welcome Sterrin Bird live from Lake Tahoe. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell people where you are or not. It might just make them jealous. Hi.
Hi, how are you, Jay? Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for hanging out, especially when you're in such an incredible place. So we'll try to get some of that great feeling from you. And Sterrin, I can't tell everybody about your whole background because that would take too long. Then you wouldn't have any time to talk. I feel a bit like Ted Lasso when the whole crowd is shouting, you know, Roy Kent, Roy Kent. It would be Sterrin Bird. She's here, she's there, she's everywhere. That's kind of you, your MO. You've been working with multiple organizations in your career, both as a consultant and in a leadership team level, higher ed, major charities, you name it, from March of Dimes to universities across the years. And today, of course, in this really significant role within Salesforce, serving the nonprofit community. So if you don't mind, I'll leave it there and let us talk, because you framed this discussion about frenetic philanthropy. And frenetic fundraising, I should say. So maybe the best place to start, if you don't mind, is just asking you what you mean by that phrase.
So having spent a large portion of my career very early on working actually with the American Red Cross, I think I was blessed with the experience of episodic and disaster fundraising. And I don't think it's lost on any of us, particularly over the course of the last week or so with what's gone on down in the Midwest and certainly in the South, that the need for us to respond to disasters is one of the ways that we do that as human beings, is that we take care of each other and we give. And so my baptism, as it were, into disaster episodic fundraising was at the Red Cross, and I was there through 9/11. And I've been thinking lately, really what has felt the last 3 or 4 years like an ongoing series of episodic disasters that have happened to us, be they natural disasters, wars, the COVID pandemic, and assorted other political and social unrest, that we have found ourselves as a sector responding over and over again to these episodes that are happening in our society, and really having to amplify the nonprofit and the sector's response to those disasters in ways that has felt off pace to me. So that's my opinion. And when I say off pace, what I mean is it's happening more frequently. And we used to, well, at least I'll say that I did, the word campaign used to be, oh, everybody's going into their next campaign. I mean, remember we used to say that, whether you were working in a university or another kind of organization. And now it feels as though we're waiting and coming up on our next episode or our next challenge. And here we are again, having to spin up and throw up these campaigns really quickly. And in some cases, at the expense of having even a moment to examine what it means to have sustained philanthropy for some of these issues that we're addressing. And so that's why I'm deeply curious about it. And I've been just doing some self-examination around that and talking to colleagues and peers around the sector about how they're feeling about it as well.
I, what do you think has changed? Because there are people in this room who maybe, and I'll just ask, if people want to say this in the chat, I'd love to know if they have memory of, for example, 9/11. Because for some of us, it's indelible. We live through it as adults, but for other people, we don't. So
Right.
we have some people answering that right now. So thank you for doing that. That's helpful. And this is true for all these very major events. There was a Woody Allen movie many years ago where there's a conversation between two people, and there's a younger person and an older person, and then they're talking about how Kennedy was shot, and the younger person says Ted Kennedy was shot. Well, now, of course, JFK and Ted Kennedy are both dead, but the point being that people don't have the same reference points, like with 9/11. But we have these events like you're talking about, but are they really coming closer together, or are we just responding differently to them?
Well, maybe that's the benefit of old age and retrospection that that you bring up in terms of having the ability to look back at that.
Yeah.
I think that the compression of a series of societal and environmental and other issues, in my impression, and I don't have the fact to back this up, I'm afraid to say, is that they're happening more frequently. And I think the escalation and our access to information is very different now than it might have been. Let's use 9/11 as an example in terms of our access to information on our phones in the right now, the real-time updates of what's happening, and our need then as human beings, just in the same way that my children are responding to things in real time on TikTok, as it were, we're
Right.
seeing right now that there is a tornado, or right now that there is a line at a food bank, or right now that there are refugees on the border of this country or that country, and we are compelled to action. And I would argue we're compelled to empathy, which ultimately the expression of that is, of course, generosity and giving to these particular issues. But I think it's a blend of, perhaps they're not happening as frequently, but our access to the information around them and our need to act, I think, is actually accelerated as a function of the technology and the information that we have access to in a way that, 20 years ago, we just didn't have.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But I wonder if maybe our interaction with that technology is also making us behave differently. I mean, both personally, because we're interacting, like you said, with TikTok, it's a very short time frame. I mean, both not just the medium itself, right? Or it's a few seconds, the videos are short, but it's also how the shelf life of many of those videos. And then if you look back, Twitter was like that too, but it's maybe a little bit longer. YouTube, a little bit longer, et cetera. And then you go back to Facebook with these monster posts that probably most of us ignore now. So I wonder if we are changing along with the media, if it's doing something to us, and our interaction with these events is different as a result.
Yeah, I would say that there's probably no question that that's true. I think just in terms of our own, I mean, I could just speak for myself, my own response to, and the amount of information that I am consuming on a given day, particularly with the blessing of the work that I am doing right now around the world. I mean, I am blessed to be able to do that work. And then if I'm really, transparent and authentic about it, it can also on certain days be very overwhelming to be examining refugee numbers and vaccine rates on one side of the globe, and then pass all the way through the United States on food banks and cause and cure organizations, and finish my day with organizations in Southeast Asia. I mean, it can be overwhelming, and we all have access to that. And that can be, it can be a lot to manage. And then I've often, in some of my writing and some of the talks I've given previously, I have often said that the compel to action, or that active empathy, as it were, is really a response to not only wanting to stand up for your fellow man, but also it's a response to anxiety in terms of people wanting to be there for one another and to say, well, what can I do? Because I'm feeling in this moment so helpless for the people I'm seeing in Ukraine, or those that I'm seeing on the border of El Paso, or the people that are in line at a food bank.
Yeah.
And I think the more we have access to that, the more that we try to activate against it. But what's in contrast to that at the risk of, I don't want to say that I'm contradicting myself, but the piece of this that is so curious to me is, while I do believe that all of those things are true in terms of the amount of information that we're taking in, and I still believe it's in our nature to activate on that, to care for one another. It's also interesting when you look at what's happening to giving in this country and
Right.
how that's happening. So they're in contrast to one another. We're getting more information about what the need is, and yet fewer people are activating in the mid-level, the mid-major, and down below on the file. So there's something to this in terms of how we as fundraisers are navigating this and how we're setting our organizations up for the longer term in terms of that sustainable philanthropy, and not just the mega gifts and not just the drip.
And I do want to ask you the how questions, because I know people want to know that and I want to know it. But I have to ask the Bryant Gumbel question first, which is why. I mean, so if people are, as you said in the past, one way to feel like, maybe you didn't put it this way, but one way I understood that was there might be a way that we could activate our agency by making a gift. And someone said this in the chat, saying that our need to act has become instant, that decades ago we would write a check and mail it. And maybe by doing that, we felt like we had some measure of control over not only the event itself, someone who had a need somewhere and we could send money and help, but also like we were in control of our own emotion about it. We didn't feel so awful just for a moment. But now the need is, if anything, greater than it's ever been. There are more people, there are more problems, more organizations who need support. And these events, they're either happening more frequently or responding to them more frequently, as you're saying. So if that need is still here for us, why is it that there's such a decline in people having the agency to act on that need, not only to help people, but to help themselves feel better about it?
Well, I think there are two things. There are not just two things. There are a few things at play in no particular order. I would say that the macroeconomic environment that we happen to be operating in right now certainly lends itself to donors like myself in that mid-range. I'm certainly not someone who's making a 6 or a 7-figure gift right now. So I have to, in fact, when I take a look at what I gave to last year and what I'm considering giving to this year, it's a different conversation for myself right now, given inflation and other issues. And I would believe that at scale that's probably true for many people. So I think that's one piece. I think in addition, the other piece of it is back to my comment about the level of information that we're receiving. I think that there is a very real fatigue going on in terms of that amount of information that we're receiving. And I think we have to be careful. And again, at the risk of waxing philosophical, I think we have to be very careful as human beings and as communities to not over-index on the storytelling and the catastrophizing of some of what's going on. And we really need to, I think, reset and readjust and contextualize how we are talking about the problems that we're facing right now as communities, and really help educate the broader public about, and this is what I mean by from frenetic to sustainable,
Right.
is when we look at, I'll give you a real example. This is something a real example. And for my friends in the food banking industry, this is a hat tip to you. It's interesting, the food banking challenges that we faced through COVID. All we had to do, because we were all locked in the house, was turn on our televisions and realize how many people were in line and what the need looked like.
Right.
Well, and then of course we had an extended SNAP credit. There was an extended, from the federal government to support low-income families. Well, when you look at it now and you see the data, the need for the food insecurity index has actually increased. The number of people that are still or now in the food lines is actually greater now than it was during the height of the pandemic. And what's interesting about that is also the SNAP credit has expired on March 1st. And so when we look at that, we have to contextualize this for the American public, for them to really understand and become educated about food insecurity as an issue, as a societal issue, and then where can they activate against that, whether it's with advocacy or whether it's with letter writing or with volunteering or with donations.
Yeah.
And so I think my answer to you, and I use that by way of example, is that I think there are some macroeconomic issues that are also going on. But I also think it's incumbent upon the sector to take a minute, if we have one, which is usually not often, and take a moment and really contextualize what these problems, whether it's food insecurity, housing and homelessness, mental health, education, access to technology, and really contextualize that on some kind of trajectory and give our donors and our supporters the benefit of we know that they are smart people, but really helping bring them along in the conversation about what the issues are and how are our organizations approaching solving them, and really invite that participation. I think that's my second answer. My third answer is that activism, particularly as our donor bases are getting much younger than me, and the activism around a particular issue and our ability to report the impact and the work that we are actually doing and accomplishing alongside how we are spending those dollars is more important than ever. So it's really, I think there are three things that are at play right now that would be worth examining. I have thoughts on each of the three. I think on the front end, if I think about the macroeconomic situation, I think the extent to which nonprofit organizations can do more with the constituents that they have and the data that they have in ways that is meaningful. I often use a marriage analogy, and for better or worse, and in good times and bad, having command of your data and your disparate data sets and being able to engage volunteers, advocates, donors, board members, direct mail people, special event people, all of those donors across your organization's constituents and supporters, the better shot you have at retaining them and actually taking them through on this journey with you. And that's where, with the education piece and that second example I gave you around food banking, when you have access to and command of that data and are able to segment and communicate with donors in that way, you can invite them to inform the context and the importance of the storytelling and how to do it. And they become your partners in that process. And that by default, of course, enables them to become even more empowered. And you're building connections and you're bolstering engagement in a way that is beyond that instant message or that tweet or that just donation button. And so I think those are really important pieces. And so, I'll just pause. I'll take a breath for a quick second. And I'm saying a lot.
Well, I do want to ask you about the storytelling piece, because you've made reference to that several times here, and it's so important, in part also because people have been telling us for the last several years, especially, it's all about storytelling. And storytelling is often about, that arc of the story where you've got a hero in the story and the rising action, the crisis, and the resolution. It's all the things we know from some writing workshop at some point in our lives. And all of that makes sense, but it's very focused on a person. So in the words of Jerry Panis, who I used to work with years ago, it's that statistics tell and stories sell. And we've seen that writ large, right? With major gift campaigns where you can focus down and say it's all encapsulated in this one person's story. That seems to work really well for raising money, at least in some ways. But what you've just talked about sounds like it could counter some of that in a productive way, if people aren't just focused on how to help, this person in Uganda survive today, that thing that's all about adrenaline, but instead understanding the situation, it does rely on them to be a better partner with us, not just somebody we can poke with a pin and hope that they'll deposit some money, but rather somebody who's going to decide with us how to change something. That's a big ask of nonprofits. So are you seeing them being able to help donors make the transition to stick with them, but be better partners rather than just responsive?
I am. And the examples I would give you, or sort of, and you're not, I agree with you. I am kind of turning that storytelling notion on its head a little bit, which is not to say that I don't think storytelling is important. I think it's extremely important. However, I think that when you engage your constituents in that process of storytelling with you, you create a level of engagement with that person, a level of ownership around the mission and what you're working on together that is actually, I mean, it's second to none. And so the example I would give is the one way to do that beyond simply media and storytelling or YouTube or TikTok or all the other ways is that I was very lucky enough years ago to take a public narrative class at the Harvard Kennedy School with a gentleman by the name of Marshall Gans, who is infamous and a remarkable man. And he's most famous actually for bringing the storytelling and the power of you, the power of us, and the power of now to the Obama campaign, the first Obama campaign. And so I use as an example of doing that at scale, where you actually disseminate and again, for lack of a better expression, baptize those people that will tell the story on behalf of your organization as it relates to them, as it relates to their community, and then as it relates to now and that call to action. And what I think is really interesting about that framework and how it relates to now is that it requires us to listen a little bit more.
Oh, yeah.
And I really think that actually there's nothing wrong or broken with the way we are telling stories right now. In fact, I would argue we've gotten much better at it in the sector and globally, you know, in large part, God bless, because of technology. But for other reasons, we've really become more, you know, I think as a community self-aware and willing to tell our own stories. But where I think we're a little off, and this is where it turns it on its head a little bit, is let's ask ourselves how much listening we are doing to not only the communities that we're serving, but to the people who are supporting us. And are we listening more? We're so quick to be pushing information out that I'm inviting us to think a little bit about how are we listening to the people that we're supporting and listening to the people that are supporting us, because there's a lot of learning in there. And you know how the old expression is the best fundraisers are sometimes the most quiet and the ones who are listening. So I just think there's something to that in terms of how we do that going forward.
It's you've worked on a lot of capital campaigns, and in my own experience too, that's what I seem to see is that if you are quiet and you listen carefully and you can tell people show people that you've heard them, that you, first of all, you're talking about the things that matter to them, but then you're also showing that you can be trusted. And
Correct.
That's so important. I wonder how you operationalize that. I'm still not sure that that's a word, and I've been using it now for a whole bunch of years.
Well, I think there's a tension between, and listen, there's a tension between scale and the need to scale and the competition around scale.
Right.
And the need to listen and to deeply engage on a personal level with your donors.
Right.
And I believe when I talk to you about sustainable fundraising, that's the challenge, is finding that middle ground.
Okay.
It's because I actually do believe that scale, in terms of back what I said before, connected data sets and doing all of the things that have to be done, because that's how business is run in this world now. We have to operate like that as nonprofit organizations. We also have to remember that what it is that we do is a very human exercise, and it is a heartfelt exercise. It is also a transaction, but it is asking someone to give of themselves and of their resources to support a social enterprise or social mission. And we have to remember that we've got to find ways to pull those two things together in a way that is not only meaningful, but authentic. And that's where I think the storytelling and the invitation of those that are closest to us to do that. I mean, it also, not for nothing, will expand those people that are able to say and speak on behalf of your mission in ways that is true and authentic. And, and you know, best fundraising is not just driven by a fundraiser. It's alongside someone who is genuinely invested and who is a volunteer and is mission activated.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm even thinking of examples of, you know, people who have ended up making these huge gifts to campaigns who started by very modest donors. And of course, that's true for many of the, if not almost all of the major donors. But if we thought about all the people who love our missions and trust us in the same way, what opportunities that would be for them and for us, it would be so much better. But is it possible to take us through an example of an organization you've seen, named or not, go from this more, it's probably the wrong word, but transactional approach, where it's just, it's the ATM machine. There's a lot of stuff happening. There's a major tsunami. Got to do something today. But started to transition that into really building that story together, and then allowing the donors at their own schedule to make bigger investments in the thing with us.
So I would say what's interesting is I worked with an organization prior to joining Salesforce that was very steeped in the area of learning differences and mental health, particularly with the associated mental health challenges that are often comorbid with ADHD or dyslexia or anxiety. Mm-hmm. And this is a remarkable organization, 70 years old, whose historic fundraising efforts had been largely event-driven, annual fund-driven, with the odd 10, 12, 13, 14 major gift on an annual basis that really skewed that in a particular direction. And as the organization approached its big anniversary, there was a real need to take a look at doing a campaign and building up the endowment in a way. And the irony of this is this was all prior to COVID, when the stigma around mental health really kind of blew up. But this organization had the foresight really to want to shore up its resources in an effort to be able to provide that kind of service to anyone in the community, regardless of their ability to pay. And when you walk in as a development officer, and this was me, and you walk in and you see a donor file that has a handful of donors on the top end, a whole lot of mixed bag in the middle, and then an awful lot of transactional donors at the top end or the bottom end, you ask yourself, well, now how are we going to get to 70 to $100 million with a file like this? And so what we did is we employed, again, I have to give another nod to the Kennedy School at the risk. I'm not doing a commercial for them, but for those of us that have used the Jeffersonian dinner model, that really
and could you explain what that is before you go any further?
Ostensibly, what we did is we grew. It's where you invite people and constituents to a dinner. That is it's made clear at the invitation that there is going to be a subject and a topic that is discussed. You can often give the guests a pre-read. You make it clear that it is not a function of solicitation, that it is about it's a generative dinner to invite them to the discussion. And then we would host a table. The beauty of it is, the best of it is you do it with, I usually never did it with more than 14 people at one king table. And it's one dinner where the topic is introduced, it is facilitated by a professional, and then the conversation is seated, and you have a generative discussion over a meal to talk about the particular issue. And in the case of this organization, we did that over a series of 12 to 14 months. And we had different board members and different donors host them and engage in them. And we really up-leveled the understanding of what the real need was in the community in a way that was authentic, real, but it was conversation. It wasn't a newsletter. It wasn't a blast. Now, that is not to say that any organization can do this. I mean, in the end, we probably had dinner with about 150 people over a year-long period. Mm-hmm. And then COVID happened. But the gift of that is that COVID happened. That campaign was able to continue and ultimately meet the needs of that community in a way that, I don't think any of us could have imagined what the need would have been and the explosion of that, particularly during lockdown for those kids and those kids' families. And the campaign was successful.
I have a couple of questions about that, because that's such a great model, and part of it is also the scaling question. But I want to acknowledge a comment that was in the chat, which is a really great question about how do you balance listening to donors with community-centric fundraising principles? Because what you just described is that dinner, often, at least in my experience in the past, that would be key donors with capacity. And that's relying on the knowledge of the organization to inform them on the community need. Do you think that there's been an adjustment in the way we think about that, or how we engage with others in the community who may not be in a position to be seated at that table for a dinner like that?
Well, I think there definitely has been. And I actually have always subscribed to the notion that the table should be diverse, and it shouldn't just be those that can afford to make a gift at X level, that absent having the community voice at a table for something like a Jeffersonian dinner, that it's a miss. And so I can just say from my experience, and when I've done that in that organization, and then I've kind of pulled that through some of the work that I'm doing now, because I think one of the things that we need to examine as a nonprofit sector and community is to get into conversation about what's really going on and how we're really gonna approach it. So I would love to see us as a nonprofit sector and nonprofit leaders employ a Jeffersonian dinner model as we start to examine our business processes and how we're going to approach, the sustained and growing needs that our organizations are trying to meet in our communities with no relief.
Right. Well, you did start this whole section of this conversation talking about listening. So it's not just a dinner for money, although that is a net result, you hope, then and in the future, because without the money, you can't perform the mission. But it's also informing the work that we do by listening to people both before and during and after a dinner like that, especially if you're holding lots of them. So I hope that that's properly channeling that question that we had from the audience. The other question I had has to do with scale, which I know you've talked about a little bit, and how organizations can take that kind of model and then find a way of scaling, especially if they have a lot of people in their database. What's a way to address that through technology, but also through the kinds of things you're talking about, just finding a way to sit down one-on-one with people or with a small group?
I think I have a couple of different thoughts about this, and also just from personal experience. I think one of the things that is incumbent upon all of us, and part of the reason I ended up in the job that I'm in now at Salesforce, really was my deep curiosity after going through what I just described to you about personally being able to be with people and to really learn and have the benefit of that kind of time. And I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but I woke up shortly, height of lockdown, shortly after a very big birthday that I had. And I knew that that COVID really was going to change the way we had to fundraise forever, because we wouldn't be able to have those dinners that I had just experienced firsthand. And again, very blessed having done so. And that's where the technology piece comes in terms of scale. Probably 4 years ago, the notion of creating an environment where you're giving donors access to a researcher or to a thought leader on a particular issue in your organization's area of expertise, doing it virtually, people probably would have poo-pooed it. I would say now, donors, I'm finding, are very appreciative of the idea that they're not traveling to a lunch, maybe having to sit through a live or a silent auction, but you can continue to create this kind of intimate experience, just like you would have at a Jeffersonian dinner, with a leading researcher in autism, for the sake of argument, and curate a really high level conversation and provide that same access and thought leadership to people in ways without having to fly. I mean, the researcher doesn't have to fly. Like, there are ways to do that piece of that personal piece of that work at scale now that probably, I would imagine 5 years ago, we wouldn't have ever thought about doing it virtually. So that's one piece of the technology. Married to that, though, I think is also comes back to the idea that I think the idea of having distributed fundraisers, if you're in a national organization, for the sake of argument, in disparate cities all over the place, I think it's incumbent upon all of us now, like we actually have to have command of our data. The days of using the excuse of I have 6 systems and they don't talk to each other, or I have one list on my desk and Sarah has a different list on her desk down the hall or in a different city. We just frankly cannot operate like that anymore. And I think there's two ends of this. There's ways to humanize the virtual experience and still have very high level, high touch conversations with donors. But we also have to have command of that data, and we have to be able to segment it and find commonalities and synergies in and among those data sets to create and to curate those high touch experiences. And
And
we just can't do it any other way anymore.
I want to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't think you're saying you have to use Salesforce to do this. And Salesforce is awesome, but
Yeah.
what you've really described is a lowering of barriers to access to technology to put all of our data in one place so we can start treating people as humans, right? I mean, that's a big deal because it wasn't long ago that people were operating on 3x5 cards, and not so long ago at all. In fact, maybe for some in the room where we're using Excel or Google
Oh, there's no
Sheets,
question.
and that's fine, but it's not getting to where we need to go. So there are lots of ways to address this problem, right?
Well, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, remember, it's people, process, and technology. And, we have to get up and over ourselves and our pronouns around data, like my data, your data, their data. It's the organization's data. Okay.
Right.
And then we really have to redefine what it means to leverage data in service of philanthropy and in service of mission. And that requires us to redefine and kind of re-educate ourselves around that. And I say to your colleagues, my colleagues, in fact, I'll be talking about this at AFP Icon in a couple of weeks. I mean, we have to really unclench our fists and get over the fear of losing or the fear of failure, and remember that what we're doing as fundraisers is inviting people to learn about what we are doing and inviting them to support it. And it's our job to make sure they have the best information they have to do that. And the only way we're able to do that, and we're sure we're communicating with the right people at the right time on the right channel, is if we have command of our data. And we can't just decide that we're not going to communicate with this piece of the file or that piece of the file. We really need to leverage, whether it's, the insights, the artificial intelligence, all of those tools, when used for good, are very effective. And we really have to re-examine all of it as a sector.
So I wonder, as people are trying to make those decisions, how they can gain some combination of the confidence and the knowledge to be able to make decisions which might seem that like they're loaded with risk, but in fact there's probably more opportunity than risk, but it still feels pretty scary when you have to move from one system or even a lack of a system to a new system, when you have to think about things like you just mentioned AI. Everybody must be getting, in fact, I'd love to hear in the chat about this, if you're getting email or ads at least once a day from some AI service that's out there. And AI can be profoundly beneficial, but if we don't really know what's baked into the services being thrown our way, it must be also very confusing. But all these things are powerful. How can we gain the confidence and knowledge to make decisions that are really advantageous for our organizations and for our staff?
It's interesting. I wish I could remember so I could provide attribution to this, so bear with me on that one. But someone once told me that one of the easiest ways to combat what's the expression I'm looking for, like unconscious bias, is to get curious. So if someone's different from you, or something it doesn't feel right, is instead of getting defensive or getting afraid, to get curious and ask questions. So this is a big leap, but I actually subscribe the same idea to technology. I am here to tell you that I am a 28, nearly 30-year veteran of the nonprofit sector before I joined a technology company. And I am the example of an old dog being able to learn new tricks. And the way I did that, honestly, was by just getting curious, because I knew in COVID that we could not operate the way we had. If I were to have to launch the same kind of major gift campaign I had to launch 10 years ago in COVID with no technology, I'd be done before I started. So I just knew there had to be a better way. And so my short answer to you, Jay, is that the best antidote to fear is curiosity, is to kick the tires, poke around, ask questions. One of the most beautiful parts about working in the nonprofit sector is that we share. And the idea that, one could argue, are we in competition for donor money? I don't believe that. I have an abundance mindset, not a scarcity mindset. So I think there's plenty to go around. There are organizations to my right and to my left doing this work well with lessons learned, who want to share and help others do that work too. That comes back to being in community with one another, whether it's at AFP or the Bridge Conference or the Nonprofit Alliance. How are we all talking about these things, and what are the lessons we're learning? And then also to remember that you do not have to boil the ocean. You do not have to fix everything all at once. The opportunity to examine technology or your business process, again, people, process, technology, it's a chance for you to stop for a second as an organization and as a leadership team and say, what's going well? What needs to be improved, and how or where might technology or better business processes or rethinking this work serve us in a way that would further maximize and increase our impact? So I think, again, it's an opportunity to get curious, like what have we learned in the last 5 years? What's our data telling us?
Mm-hmm.
And then how might we proceed in a way that when the next episode comes, or when the next hurricane comes, we're actually ready to activate in a way that perhaps we couldn't have even imagined 5 years ago.
You mentioned AFP, and one of the things that strikes me is that there's going to be a big exhibit area in there, and people will have to, for those going to AFP, and if you're going to AFP, would you say so in the chat? Because I'd love to know. But as people go through there, this isn't always true, but I think this year you will walk through the exhibit hall to get to certain things, like a meal. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple ways that people interact in that hall. One is you stand as far away from the vendors as you can as you walk by. And the other is, you're kind of going and grabbing stuff off the desks that you might be able to bring back to your kids. And by the way, I'm not judging, because all of these are things that I've done too. My point is that at all those desks, people are offering products and services that may not be for you, but wouldn't it be great if for you and for those vendors, that we had conversations with each of them to learn something from one another? So instead of just letting them sell us stuff and trying to buy stuff only when we knew we had the budget, we actually just tried to figure out together what we were trying to do. And having been a vendor as well as a consultant and a grant maker and a fundraiser within, I always wondered about this weird thing where people kind of scurry through there like they're afraid somebody's going to catch them with a net. I mean, what you just described is interesting from the standpoint that there will be some people at AFP and all these conferences that have something to sell, but that may not be nearly as important as the conversation that we could have with them about what is that we're trying to do.
Yeah,
because you must be having that internally at Salesforce all the time, right? I mean,
absolutely.
That's the only way you guys have grown, is by coming up with new stuff, and you don't do that by sitting in a room and just doing it.
In fact, I would say that more often than not, our customers inform the product direction. And right. So, that's part of what my job is to go out and talk to the customers and invite the customers in to provide that feedback. So, I said, I spoke at something a few months ago, and I said, we're only as good as what the market demands of us. And so I think that's where we can learn from each other and really listen. And, I'm going to be standing in a booth for 2 days. Come see me and say hello. It'd be fun to see everyone. And I think, again, I just come back to get curious. I mean, not for nothing, I walk through AFP now and I'm curious. What are they doing over there? What's going on over there? And how do we learn from each other? And I think that's how we make each other better.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that learning goes across lots of different data points, right? I mean, part of it is also intergenerational. There will be people there at the meeting, and here I'm talking about the people walking around the halls, eating lunch, sure, giving a talk, just attending for the first time. Some people are there who are 22, some people there who are 82, and quite literally, and they'll both have something interesting that we should be listening to and asking about. So I didn't mean
that sounds like a good idea for a panel discussion.
Oh, just having that kind of intergenerational discussion?
Yes,
oh,
absolutely. Yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, at least people are now not beating up on the millennials so much anymore, which I thought was always kind of ridiculous. But it seems like people are doing a job on Gen Z, maybe because of TikTok discussions on Capitol Hill. I don't know.
So, I think I learn more from my kids now than I do from anybody else. So there you have it.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have something that we can learn from each other if we ask good questions, which I guess gets to another part of this, which is asking the right questions? And I know that's too big of a question, but how do we get to the point where we're doing that? Especially because within our offices, whether it's big or small, and you can speak to this, having been in various organizations of large scale, but very different, and now being at this very large tech company, there must have been incidences where raising your hand, asking questions, pushing the envelope a bit must have been challenging, maybe even scary. How do you get up for that?
Well, I garnered the nickname in one of my previous jobs of someone used to call me General Disruption. So that was a nickname I had at one point. I would probably argue that to this day, some of my colleagues at Salesforce would say the same thing about me. I'm a poker. And I think it's appropriately so. Like, I think it's important that we ask questions and that we, the framework I often come back to is, this is old school, old school business books here, are the must, the woulds, and the shoulds, and those 5 whys. So, often I think particularly as we come out of the last few years, and I think this is true. I mean, let's face it, you would have to be under a rock not to see the tectonic shift that's happening in high tech right now at every company in terms of examining their business and their workforce, just in many of the same ways that many of the greatest nonprofit organizations had to do at the height of the pandemic that were event driven. Okay, so I'm going to I'll make that correlation. What must we do as nonprofit professionals to meet the needs of the communities that we serve? Then what, should we do if our, money, the economy swings up, if our business processes are doing well, and then what would we do if there was a blue sky moment? And I think that if we examine our business processes in those 3 ways, it's an important one. And then to drill into that, as you identify the musts, the woulds, and the shoulds, why? Ask yourself those 5 whys. Why must we do this? Why must we do this? And really dig into it and get very, very clear about the purpose and the reason that you're doing this work. And then ultimately, I have found, both professionally and personally, that guides the entire process, and that it invites the inquiry around change and around examining those business processes, because you can be really clear about what I have to do in order to feed my community, or to meet the mental health need of the community, or to make sure that a certain subset of our community has after school care or iPads or access to technology. And then why am I doing this? And it really just informs that piece. And it also, that same framework works, by the way, when you're inviting people to learn, to understand their why. Why do they support you? Back to that storytelling piece. Right. What's my story of why I support a food bank? What does that mean for us as a community? And why is that important right now? Back to using, Marshall's framework. I think it's important, it's a lot of it is born out of, really understanding our purpose work and what the world needs, and what we're good at and what we provide. Like, how does that all come together to make sure that we're actually meeting the need? And then how are we talking about the impact? I think it's just important that we get really clear about that and maybe let a lot of the noise go.
You talked earlier about kind of a COVID moment that you had. Yeah. And I think a lot of people have had some kind of COVID moment, or kind of a realization or something like that. Where are you on the other end of that? I mean, I know it's not totally gone. There are people still getting sick today, but how has this influenced your thinking as you had this kind of pause, which it sounds like is related to everything you've been talking about, just kind of taking a breath in a positive way, thinking about our processes, asking ourselves these questions that you were just framing for us, and then moving forward with, some degree of intention. I mean, may not be the right word, but where have you gone from having that COVID moment to where you are now? How has it informed what you're thinking about next? On
a very personal note, I am very clear about what my purpose is right now. And part of that is, prior to COVID, I have enjoyed a remarkably blessed and incredible career raising money with some of the most unbelievable organizations on the planet. I have also suffered through changes and transformations that both worked well and some that were abysmal and disastrous.
Mm.
And my COVID moment was, how are my colleagues going to be able to do this work absent systems, processes, and technology? And that's what led me to the job that I'm in now. And so my moment and my intention right now is that I have both done it. I've lived the crummy and the lousy and the fantastic through transformation. And I also feel very clear about my role in creating space for my peers and my colleagues to have that inquiry and that place of curiosity and have a safe conversation with me about how to even think about it. And so my vocation in this, as much as I have a job, my vocation is to help the entire sector do better, leveraging technology. Like, that's really how I show up every day. Like, how can I help you, Jay, ask the questions that you need? I often describe myself as kind of like a patient advocate for the sector as it relates to navigating inquiry and curiosity around technology and Salesforce in particular, given my role. And then at the same time, in partnership with my incredibly bright and really innovative colleagues, helping them understand what it's really like to do this work, what it's really like when you have, when you have millions of dollars of donations coming through a system and the system breaks. Because it has happened to me, and it's happened to people, I'm sure, on this call. Like, that's a very real thing. And when you hold the work that you do in a social organization as a real responsibility to your community, and the system breaks, you were like, it's a moral dilemma in addition to a technological dilemma.
Yeah.
And I bring that sort of humanness, I think, to so that's my answer to your question is, what am I thinking about now? I'm thinking about what is my role in this as a sector. And that's why an invitation like this to even be able to talk about that is not only very humbling, but it's a chance for me to be really authentic about that. Like, it's who I am. I'm wired. I have been wired since I was 14 years old to help people. I wake up every day and ask myself, how can I change the world? And how I'm trying to change the world now is really to create space for the sector to be able to work smarter and to get more resources moving so that more people get the help and access to the things that they need. It's full stop. That's why I get up in the morning.
I just have to say, on a personal note, one of the posts on LinkedIn about this, there was somebody who's known you since I think you were 14, who was talking about how they imagine that you would, of course, be able to do and will do all the things that you're doing. And I think it speaks to the fact that this kind of honesty and remembering one another and just greeting people where you are is so valuable. And when we can do it in places like LinkedIn, it really does reaffirm your faith in everything we do and how we work with one another. I want to thank you for that. And I want to make sure I honor the one last question here as we close, because it's a good one. And it's one that everybody always asks, which are if there are a couple of takeaways that you'd like people to have. And before we do that, I also want to just acknowledge another question about finding out data on your donors. You're going to see at the end of this presentation, there'll be some slides come up and a QR code, and you can learn a lot about them by just taking a picture of that, or you can reach out to me directly, and maybe Sterrin can help you with that as well. But you can reach out to me anytime, either through LinkedIn or directly. My DonorSearch email address is that's Jay, at DonorSearch.net, and I'll be happy to help with all the various sources out there, including the one that you'll see behind that QR code. But do you have any kind of final words for advice for the people in the audience who might want a couple of takeaways to bring back to their offices?
So I would say, again, I'll just reiterate that curiosity is the antidote to fear. So if you're curious about any of this, dig in and poke around and kick the tires. Ask the hard questions. That would be my second one. And third would be, thank you for being the agents of moving empathy to action, because that's really what the sector is all about. So curiosity, ask questions and kick those tires. And again, deep gratitude to all of you for, bringing the world what it needs when it needs it. So I just appreciate being invited today, and thank you so very much, Jay. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sterrin. I love this conversation, and I really appreciate your having it with us. And the reason I was laughing when you said, made a reference to an old dog is not you, but I've seen what no one else here has seen, which is you actually have a couple of old dogs beneath your feet. No one will need to see them right now, but they are there. It's not you. The rest of us do need to learn new tricks, and thank you for teaching us a few, as well as maybe a little bit of good deep breathing as we take on the big challenges of the future. Really great to talk with you. And I want to thank you all for hanging out today. Sterrin, if people want to find out more about you, where can they follow you or reach out to you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Sterrin Bird, easy enough to find. And and there's not very many Sterrins that I've seen. So it's Sterrin, and it's pretty easy to find me on Google as well. So you can just find me there and reach out anytime. I'm here for it. So thank you so much.
She truly is. And if you're at AFP, do stop by there. You'll find her.
Don't run away from the booth.
Don't run away.
Don't run away from the booth. I'll be in there for 2 full days. So come say hello.
As my friend Paul Edwards says, run toward the barking dog. That's the that's the major good line. Anyway, thank you all for hanging out. Do join us next week. You'll learn all about the upcoming sessions right now. Take care.